Oppression is the limiting of others' freedoms.
Oppression is a socio-political phenomenon in which a certain subgroup or a certain set of people are restricted from doing certain things.
Oppression is when a group of people or a singular person within a society don't have the same access to opportunities or just anything else in society that others may have.
Oppression is multifaceted and comes in many forms, but generally it's a exclusion um, from the community that a person belongs to.
This is Jane Smith. She's a low-income woman. Many people in society may argue that Jane Smith is part of multiple oppressed groups. She herself may be oppressed. But how do we know? How can we clearly define oppression? Now imagine a bird cage. There's a bird inside and wires on the outside, keeping that bird trapped inside. The cage inhibits the bird from flying out. The cage traps the bird, not allowing the bird to do what it wants. Marilyn Frye uses the metaphor of a birdcage to explain how we should define and think about oppression. Frye worries that people think too narrowly about the advantages that society gives to certain people. For example, if Jane Smith doesn't get a job because she is late to her interview, Frye is concerned that people view that event in a vacuum rather than a part of a system of structures that limit Jane's opportunities. For example, Jane may have had to walk to her job interview because she was denied a loan to buy a car due to her wealth. She may have been fired from her previous job because the bus ran late one too many times. She may have been evicted after being fired from that job, and she may have had a hard time finding a new home near work because people won't rent to her with her eviction record. To illustrate these interconnected barriers, Frye discusses a birdcage. The birdcage analogy shows an oppressed person as a bird inside of a birdcage with many wires. When looking from a macroscopic view, it's obvious that the bird is limited by the wires of the cage. The bird cannot escape, the bird cannot do what it wishes. The bird is oppressed. If you take a more microscopic view of the birdcage, you may only see one or two of the wires. It may look like the bird could just fly out the other side of the cage. By looking just at the individual wires, you don't see how difficult the bird's situation is. If you just look at Jane not getting the job after being late to the interview, it doesn't look like oppression. If you look at the entire situation, it does look like oppression. Frye's birdcage analogy helps us understand that we can't overcome oppression by tearing down a singular problematic institution. Taking away one wire from the birdcage won't set the bird free. There will still be many different interacting institutions that are still limiting Jane's opportunities. Jane getting a job won't fix all the other barriers holding her back. In order for us to stop a person or a group of people from being oppressed, we must look at all of the societal structures negatively affecting that group. Frye helps us understand this. One argument against Frye's analogy is that it doesn't address the more complex issues of oppression. Who builds the birdcage? Are the people who build the birdcage the same people who benefit from it? Do some people have more restrictive cages than others? What are the consequences of being stuck in the birdcage? While these questions are all vital to our understanding of oppression, Frye's decision not to address them in this analogy does not take away from the analogy. The birdcage is meant to explain the importance of taking a holistic view of situations of oppression. Frye's birdcage analogy highlights an important and often forgotten aspect of oppression. Oppression is not one bad thing happening to someone like Jane. It's a system of institutions stopping a person from achieving what they wish to achieve. Frye worries that people view oppression too narrowly, only looking at single instances of disadvantage. That is why the birdcage analogy is helpful. It forces us to look at the many things affecting a person or a group of people that cause disadvantage.
These systems of oppression don't only limit Jane's access to the job or the housing markets. They cause what Sandra Lee Bartky calls psychological oppression as well. Psychological oppression is complex in that it is a cause and a result of the birdcage. It is both a wire and a consequence of the existence of the birdcage. Bartky says that psychological oppression is being weighed down in your mind so much that you diminish your own self-esteem, becoming, in a sense, your own oppressor. When people internalize the ways that society tells them they are less than, it becomes easier to oppress them. And these internal effects are reinforced by the external, social, political, and economic constraints of the birdcage. After Jane receives a rejection letter from her potential employer, she starts to believe she is not good enough to hold down a job. This may cause her to do worse at her next interview, or discourage her from looking for jobs altogether. According to Bartky, psychological oppression for women manifests in 3 ways: stereotyping, sexual objectification, and cultural domination. Stereotypes are widely held, oversimplified beliefs about certain social groups that are often false. Bartky says that stereotyping threatens women's autonomy and self-determination by reinforcing false beliefs about what they can and cannot do, which furthers their oppression. Sexual objectification occurs when women's sexual parts or functions are separated from the rest of her personality and either objectified or seen as representative of her as a whole. This sexual objectification is used to further disadvantage women by refusing to acknowledge their existence as a complex human. Cultural domination is defined as the idea that all items in the general life of people are sexist. Bartky says that our languages, systems, pop culture, art, and other institutions are all sexist because females have always existed as half a people, inferior to men. But what if women don't believe they're oppressed? Maybe Jane tells you she doesn't feel oppressed by men, but makes a conscious choice to be a housewife first and foremost. Does this refute some of Bartky's theory of psychological oppression? Is it only oppression if you feel limited by it? Bartky would say this situation is still a result of interlocking systems, that Jane has been conditioned to think she has fulfilled her full purpose in life willingly. There are some instances in which we agree with Bartky. If Jane is conditioned by society to believe all she is good enough to do is stay at home and be a housewife, that would be oppression. However, if Jane actually decides on her own terms that she desires to be a housewife, then she is not oppressed. The term decides is an important one. If someone's decision truly is their own, that would not be oppression. Bartky helps us understand that Jane, or any other oppressed person's decision, may be shaped by what society has taught them. Bartky refers to this as mystification. Mystification is when the reality of the agency and capabilities of someone who is psychologically oppressed are so obscured by society that people either falsely believe they are living up to their full potential because society tells them that's all they can achieve, or they feel internally guilty that they have not done more without recognizing the barriers at work, without seeing the birdcage. Bartky says that these forms of psychological oppression also lead women to believe that only certain parts of them matter or count for the entirety of their whole existence. This is what she describes as fragmentation. If Jane becomes a housewife because she feels it's all that she deserves and only sees her existence as useful for cleaning, then she is experiencing fragmentation. Bartky's explanation of psychological oppression provides insight to one of the consequences of being trapped in Frye's birdcage, while also explaining the significance of an under-discussed wire. Psychological oppression diminishes the agency and self-esteem of those being oppressed and allows the oppressor to continue this oppression. These two thinkers help us begin to understand oppression, but our work isn't done yet. Understanding is only the first step. It is our responsibility to take this knowledge and turn it into action. We must continue this dialogue and integrate into everyday life and keep trying to understand how oppression affects members of society like Jane. How can you keep this conversation going? What can you do to learn more about the effects of oppression? To learn more, check out Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail and his 4 steps to nonviolent resistance. The links are in the bio below.